What would you do if everything you owned was stolen from you in an instant, and your only path forward was to purchase the one thing no one else on earth would ever want? For 18-year-old Jane Haskins, a single $2 bill was the humiliating price of a ruined outlaw's cabin, a place so feared and reviled it had been left to the mercy of the Wyoming seasons. But the truth buried beneath its rotting floorboards would prove that the most dismissed places often hold the most valuable secrets. Settle in, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from, as we tell a story of courage and resilience on the far, unforgiving edge of the American frontier. The dust of Redemption Gulch settled on Jane's worn boots, a fine red powder that felt like the grit of her own life settling into every crack and seam. It had been a week since her guardian, a man she'd called Uncle, had sold the family claim from under her. Thaddeus, her father's half-brother, had arrived with a sad face and a satchel full of legal papers she couldn't read, explaining that the debts were too great. The ranch her father had carved out of the wilderness with his own two hands, the house whose every board he had sawn and set, was gone. The memory of those hands, broad and calloused, was a fresh and constant ache in her chest. Now, she stood with nothing but the threadbare dress on her back, a thin blanket roll, a few carefully folded dollars, and the one thing she'd fought to keep, her father's felling axe, its handle worn smooth as riverstone from his grip. The town was no comfort. It was a place of sidelong glances and sharp, whispered judgments. She was an orphan again, but worse this time. At 10, when her parents had succumbed to winter fever within a day of each other, she was a tragedy to be pitied. At 18, cast out and penniless, she was a problem to be avoided. She saw the notice tacked to the post outside the assayer's office, its corner flapping in the dry wind. A public auction of seized and abandoned properties. Most were mining claims or lots in town she could never afford. Then her eyes fell on the last item, scrawled in hasty ink at the bottom of the page, the Blackwood cabin. Sold as is. All claims forfeit. A current of recognition, cold and sharp, went through the small crowd that milled nearby. Men nudged each other. A woman pulled her child closer. Jane had heard the stories. The cabin was a place of bad luck and bad blood, the last known hideout of the outlaw Shadow Sykes, who'd been gunned down on its porch 5 years prior. They said his ghost still lingered, soured by betrayal, and that the ground itself was cursed. Jane felt a strange kinship with the idea of a place haunted by betrayal. She looked from the notice to the distant dark line of the Blackwood Ridge, then down at the few dollars clutched in her hand. A flicker of something hard and defiant, something she hadn't felt in weeks, began to burn behind her eyes. She would go to the auction. She had nothing left to lose, not even her dignity. That had been sold right along with her father's land. The auction took place in the dusty clearing between the saloon and the livery stable, a makeshift stage for the town's small dramas. Mr. Abernathy, the portly auctioneer, worked his way through the list of properties with a practiced, booming voice. Claims were sold, debts were settled, and fortunes, however small, were redistributed under the harsh afternoon sun. Jane stood at the very back, a slight, still figure wrapped in a silence that set her apart from the boisterous crowd. She kept her hand on the head of her father's axe, which leaned against her leg, its familiar weight a small anchor in the churning sea of her uncertainty. Finally, Abernathy reached the last item. "All right, folks, last on the docket." He cleared his throat and spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into the dust. The Blackwood cabin. Up on the ridge. You all know the one. A nervous titter ran through the crowd. He didn't need to elaborate. The story of Shadow Sykes was woven into the town's brief history. A ghost story told to frightened children and newcomers. Place is half fallen, full of rot and varmints, and likely the ghost of Sykes himself, the auctioneer continued, a smirk playing on his lips. So we'll start the bidding low. Who'll give me $5 for the land and the lumber? Silence, a heavy, absolute silence broken only by the buzz of flies and the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer. Men shuffled their feet and looked away. $5 was a pittance for any piece of land, however remote. But no one wanted the stigma. No one wanted to invite that kind of trouble, spectral or otherwise, into their lives. Abernathy's smirk widened into a grin. $5 for a roof over your head, boys. Even a leaky one. More silence. From the front of the crowd, a well-dressed, heavy-set man laughed out loud. It was Silas Croft, the owner of the largest ranch in the valley, and the man who held sway over most of the town's business. "You'd have to pay me to haul that garbage away, Abernathy," Croft boomed, and his cronies chuckled along with him. Abernathy's face fell slightly. He sighed, ready to dismiss the lot. "All right then, anyone? Any bid at all? $1, just to clear the books?" He looked around, his gaze passing over Jane without seeing her. In the ringing silence, a clear, steady voice, surprisingly loud for coming from such a slight frame, cut through the air. $2. Every head turned. The crowd parted as if by a silent command, revealing Jane standing alone at the back, her chin lifted, her eyes fixed on the auctioneer. For a moment, there was only stunned disbelief. Then, a low wave of laughter started, beginning with Croft and spreading through the rest. It wasn't friendly laughter. It was sharp and cruel. Jane's face burned, but she did not look away. Abernathy stared at her, his mouth half open. "The girl bids $2, he said, shaking his head in disbelief. He looked at Croft, at the other men. $2. Going once? The laughter was his answer. Going twice? He looked back at Jane, a flicker of something like pity in his eyes. Sold, he mumbled, bringing the gavel down on his ledger with a dull thud. To the girl. For $2. Jane walked forward, the whispers of the crowd like a physical force against her. She placed 2 worn dollar bills on the ledger, took the deed Abernathy had hastily signed, and turned to leave. As she passed, Silas Croft stepped into her path. "Enjoy the splinters, girl," he sneered, his eyes cold and dismissive. "And the nightmares." Jane said nothing. She simply walked past him, clutching the flimsy piece of paper that was now her only possession in the world. The town's mocking laughter a bitter song at her back. Did she just buy her own grave? Or is there a reason the outlaw chose that specific, forgotten place? Let us know what you think is hidden in that old cabin down in the comments. And be sure to subscribe for the rest of the story. Because when Jane finally reached the property line, the silence that greeted her was older and deeper than any ghost. The purchase of the cabin solidified Jane's status as a pariah. Before, she was an unfortunate stray. Now, she was the town fool. The whispers that had followed her turned into open stares and poorly concealed smirks. When she walked into the Redemption Gulch General Store to spend the last of her money, the small group of men loafing by the stove fell silent, watching her as if she were a peculiar and slightly dangerous animal. The storekeeper, a man who had known her father, suddenly found it hard to meet her eyes. He weighed her flour and salt with a heavy hand, his thumb seeming to press on the scale. The prices he quoted were higher than they had been a week ago, a silent tax on her foolishness. Jane paid without complaint, her face a mask of calm she did not feel. She was counting out her coins when the door swung open and Silas Croft entered, filling the space with his bulk and his booming voice. He saw her immediately. Well, he said, a malicious grin spreading across his face. "Stocking the larder for your new palace? Be sure to get extra traps. I hear the rats on Blackwood Ridge are as big as house cats." His companions, a pair of ranch hands with mean eyes, laughed on cue. Jane ignored him, gathering her small sacks. She was acutely aware of every eye in the store on her, of the suffocating weight of their collective judgment. She turned to leave, her only thought to get away, to breathe air that wasn't thick with contempt. As she pushed the door open, a hand gently touched her arm. She flinched, expecting another jibe, But it was Ilara, the town's laundress. Ilara was an old woman, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, her hands permanently puckered from soap and water. She was a fixture in the town, as silent and enduring as the mountains, and most people paid her no mind. She pressed a small, cloth-wrapped parcel into Jane's hand. It was unexpectedly warm and smelled of dried herbs. "Some ground don't forget," Ilara murmured, her voice a dry, rustling whisper like autumn leaves. "It remembers who works it." Jane stared at her, uncomprehending. The old woman's dark eyes held a strange, knowing light. Before Jane could form a question, Ilara gave a short, sharp nod and shuffled away, disappearing around the corner of the building. Jane looked down at the parcel of herbs, then back at the door of the general store. The laughter had subsided, but the feeling of being an outsider was a cold, hard knot in her stomach. She clutched the warm herbs, the strange words echoing in her mind. It wasn't a warning, and it wasn't a blessing. It was something else, something she couldn't yet name. With the town at her back, she adjusted the weight of her pack and started the long walk toward the ridge, toward the cursed ground that was now her only home. The journey to the Blackwood cabin was a pilgrimage of solitude. The path that led from town quickly dwindled from a wagon-rutted road to a faint deer trail, and then to nothing at all. Jane followed the deed's crude map, keeping the chattering waters of Granite Creek to her left as she climbed. She had no horse, no wagon, only what she could carry on her own 2 feet. Her pack was heavy with flour, salt, and a small sack of nails, but the heaviest thing she carried was her father's axe, its hickory handle strapped to the outside of her blanket roll. With every step upward, the air grew thinner and cooler, scented with pine and damp earth. The sounds of the town, the blacksmith's hammer, the saloon's tinny piano, the chorus of derision, faded, replaced by the sigh of the wind in the high pines and the scolding cry of a jay. The land was beautiful in a way that was both breathtaking and deeply intimidating. Jagged peaks clawed at the sky, and the valleys were choked with shadows that seemed to hold their breath. This was a world that did not care for human concerns. It was vast, indifferent, and watchful. She arrived at dusk, the time of day when the world turns from gold to gray. The clearing appeared suddenly, a wound in the dense forest, and in its center stood the cabin. It was worse than she had imagined, worse than the stories. The roof on one side had collapsed into a skeletal grin, and the porch sagged as if it had knelt in defeat years ago. A door hung from a single leather hinge, creaking a mournful rhythm in the breeze. Boards were missing from the walls, leaving dark, staring gaps. The whole structure leaned, looking as though a strong gust of wind might push it over entirely. It smelled of rot, of mildew, of the deep, final sorrow of abandonment. A wave of despair, cold and sickening, washed over Jane. She had traded the last of her money and all of her pride for this pile of decaying logs. The laughter of the town echoed in her ears, and for a moment she was tempted to turn around, to walk back down the mountain and face whatever humiliation awaited her. But where would she go? Back to being a burden? A charity case? Back to the pity and the scorn? No. Her jaw tightened. She had bought this place. It was hers. The thought was as grim as the cabin itself. She slid the heavy pack from her shoulders, her muscles screaming in protest. She would not sleep inside that ruin tonight. Not yet. She untied her father's axe. The familiar weight of it in her hands was a comfort. She found a stand of deadfall pine at the edge of the clearing and, with steady, practiced swings, began to chop firewood. The sharp thwack of the steel biting into wood was a satisfying, defiant sound in the immense quiet. She built a small, careful fire a safe distance from the cabin, cooked a miserable meal of flour and water paste on a hot stone, and wrapped herself in her thin blanket. She lay with her back against a large boulder, the axe resting by her side, its polished edge gleaming in the firelight. Above her, the sky was a black velvet cloth punched through, with a brilliant spray of stars. There was no sound but the crackle of her fire and the low moan of the wind through the broken cabin. She was utterly alone, but for the first time in weeks, it felt less like a punishment and more like a simple fact. The first days on Blackwood Ridge were a brutal education in the art of survival. Jane woke each morning to the bone-deep chill of the high country. Her first task to coax the embers of her fire back to life. She worked from dawn until dusk, driven by a desperate, silent urgency. The cabin was not a home. It was a hostile entity, a collection of problems to be solved. She used the axe to fell a young pine, and with painstaking effort, stripped its branches and cut crude planks to patch the gaping holes in the walls. She gathered moss and clay from the creek bed, mixing a thick plaster to chink the gaps between the logs, her hands quickly becoming raw and caked with mud. She found a spring of clear, cold water a short walk from the clearing, a small blessing that felt like a major victory. The work was relentless, her body a symphony of aches and pains. But with each repaired wall, with each sealed crack, a sliver of despair was replaced by a sliver of ownership. A week passed. The cabin, while still a grim and sorry sight, was now weathertight, if not welcoming. One afternoon, as a cold rain began to fall, Jane turned her attention to the interior. The floor was a treacherous landscape of dirt, animal droppings, and decades of accumulated leaves. As she swept the debris towards the broken hearth, her makeshift broom of pine boughs snagged on a floorboard. It was loose, like many of the others, but this one felt different. It shifted under her weight with a distinct seesaw motion, not the spongy give of rot. She knelt, pushing aside the grime. The board was oak, unlike the pine of the surrounding floor, and it seemed to sit slightly higher. She made a mental note of it, too tired and overwhelmed to investigate further. Her focus was on the immediate, a dry place to sleep. As she spent more time in the clearing, she began to notice the quiet rhythms of the place. The animals were strangely unafraid. A doe and her fawn would often graze at the edge of the woods, watching her with dark, curious eyes. A large hawk circled high above the clearing every afternoon, its sharp cries the only punctuation in the long, silent hours. It never seemed to hunt in the valley, only to watch. It was a strange, persistent vigilance. She felt less like an intruder and more like an object of quiet observation. One evening, exhausted, she sat on the porch step, which she had shored up with a few sturdy rocks. Her eyes fell on the threshold stone, the large, flat rock that formed the entrance. She had crossed it 100 times without a thought. But now, in the low, slanted light of dusk, she saw it clearly. It was not the rough, gray granite of the surrounding mountainside. It was a slab of dark green river slate, worn smooth by water and time, and on its edge, almost hidden by shadow, was a small, deliberately carved symbol, a simple spiral. It was out of place, just like the oak floorboard. The cabin was still a wreck, but it was beginning to feel less like a place of simple decay and more like a place of secrets. Jane ran her fingers over the cool, smooth spiral, a question forming in her mind for the first time. Why? The sight of a man on horseback at the edge of her clearing sent a jolt of alarm through Jane. She instinctively reached for her axe, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The rider wasn't from the town's usual crowd of loafers. He sat tall in the saddle, his posture easy and competent, on a fine-boned bay that watched her with intelligent eyes. He wore a dusty hat and a practical canvas coat, and his face, weathered by sun and wind, held a look of quiet curiosity rather than malice. He stopped his horse a respectful distance away and tipped his hat. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low, calm baritone. "Saw your smoke from my ridge. Figured I'd see who was brave enough to take on the old Sykes place." He dismounted, his movements unhurried, and looped the reins around a low-hanging branch. "Name's Will Kincaid. My ranch borders this land to the west." Jane remained silent, wary. She knew the Kincaid name. His ranch was a smaller operation than Croft's, but well regarded. "Jane Haskins," she finally said, her voice tight. Will nodded, his eyes taking in the patched walls, the newly cleared yard, the stack of firewood. He didn't mock, he didn't pity, he simply assessed. "You've been busy," he remarked. This place was ready to fall to its knees. He walked over to the main wall and pressed a hand against the logs. "Still is," he added, more to himself than to her. "That main beam is giving way. A good snow and the whole thing will come down on top of you." He looked at her, his gaze direct and serious. "I'm not here to trouble you, Miss Haskins, but I can't in good conscience leave you to face a Wyoming winter in this state. I've got some tools and some experience. I'd be obliged if you'd let me help you shore up these walls." Jane was taken aback. It was the first offer of genuine help she'd received since losing her home. She looked from his steady, honest face to the leaning cabin. She knew he was right. She could patch holes, but she couldn't raise a sagging roofline on her own. "I can't pay you," she said, the words tasting like ash. Will Kincaid shook his head. "Wouldn't take it if you could. Let's just call it a neighborly investment in not having to pull you out of the wreckage come January." For the next 3 days, they worked side by side. Will was a quiet and patient teacher, showing her how to use a lever and fulcrum to lift the sagging beam, how to notch a new support post, how to secure it without compromising the old structure. His presence was a quiet, steadying force. They spoke little, the work itself a form of conversation. To properly brace the new posts, they had to clear the entire cabin floor. It was during this process that Jane pointed to the odd oak plank. "This one's different," she said. "It's not rotten." Will knelt beside her, running a calloused hand over the wood. He examined the edges closely. "No nail holes," he murmured, his brow furrowed. "And look here." He pointed to a small, almost invisible notch carved into the side, perfectly sized for a prying tool. A shared look of curiosity passed between them. This wasn't a repair, it was a feature. "Let's get this beam set," Will said, his voice even. "Then we'll see what this is all about." The labor, the shared purpose, was mending something in Jane that had felt irrevocably broken. As they worked, her father's axe leaned against the wall, a silent companion. The section ended with Will fitting the tip of his pry bar into the small notch. With a grunt of effort, he put his weight into it, and the board groaned, lifting slowly from its long hidden resting place. The air in the cabin grew thick with anticipation. The oak plank came away with a final, splintering sigh, revealing not the dark earth beneath, but a rectangular hollow neatly lined with oilcloth to keep out the damp. It was a secret space, deliberately made and carefully hidden. Will held the lantern high, its yellow light pushing back the shadows and illuminating the small cache. Jane knelt, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The hollow was just large enough to hold a single, stout leather satchel. It was dark with age, its surface unadorned, but it felt heavy with significance even before she touched it. With trembling fingers, she reached into the space. The leather was cold and stiff. She hooked her fingers under the straps and pulled. It was heavier than she expected. She lifted it out and set it on the dusty floor between them, the lantern light flickering over its worn surface. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the low whisper of the wind outside, a sound that suddenly felt like a held breath. Jane's fingers fumbled with the stiff brass buckles. They finally gave way with a rusty click. She lifted the heavy flap. The smell that rose from the satchel was the scent of things long hidden, dry paper, crumbling leather, and the faint metallic tang of ink. She reached inside and her fingers closed around a thick, crisp packet of papers. She drew it out into the lantern light. They were bearer bonds, issued by the Union Pacific Railroad, each one promising a sum that made her head swim. There were dozens of them. It was a fortune, more money than she could possibly imagine, lying there on the floor of a $2 cabin. Will let out a low whistle. Sykes wasn't just a rustler, he murmured, his eyes wide. Beneath the bonds was another, softer bundle, tied with a faded blue ribbon. Jane carefully untied it. They were letters. Not business, but personal. The handwriting was elegant, surprisingly so. They were love letters, written by the outlaw Shadow Sykes to a woman named Amelia. They spoke of a life he wished he could have, of regret, and of a deep, abiding bitterness. He wrote of being trapped, of being used by men who smiled at him in public and plotted with him in private. He was not the monster of the town's stories. He was a man cornered, betrayed, and fighting back in the only way he knew how. At the very bottom of the satchel lay one final object, a small, black, leather-bound ledger. It felt heavier than the bonds and letters combined. Jane took it, her hands shaking slightly, and opened it to the first page. The same elegant script from the letters filled the pages, but this was not poetry. It was an accounting. Dates, a description of services rendered, cattle driven from Croft North Range, silver shipment from the Blue Lode waylaid, and next to each entry, a name and a sum. At the top of the list, repeated more than any other, was the name Silas Croft. The ledger was a meticulous record of betrayal. It detailed, with chilling precision, how Croft and a half-dozen other respectable men of Redemption Gulch had hired Shadow Sykes to be their own personal disaster. They had paid him to rustle their own herds, raid their own freight, and create a reign of terror for which they could then collect handsome insurance payments and federal relief funds. Sykes, the feared outlaw, had been their employee. He was the shadow they had cast themselves to hide their greed. Jane looked up from the ledger, her eyes meeting Will's in the flickering light. The truth she now held was a weight far greater than gold, and far more dangerous. A sudden, violent gust of wind slammed against the cabin, making the newly braced timbers groan. The lantern flame danced wildly, casting their elongated shadows against the walls like spectral giants. Outside, the sky had turned a bruised purple-gray, and the first hard pellets of snow began to hiss against the roof. The blizzard descended without warning, a white fury that erased the world, isolating their small, repaired cabin in a sea of swirling snow. The crisis had moved from the discovery in the satchel to the immediate reality of survival. The storm trapped them, forcing an intimacy and a reckoning. They built up the fire in the hearth, the warmth a small bastion against the howling wind. Will secured a blanket over the doorway while Jane made coffee. The ledger lay on the small, rough table between them, a silent, powerful presence. "What are you going to do?" Will finally asked, his voice low and serious, cutting through the storm's roar. Jane traced the name Silas Croft with her finger. "This isn't just about money," she said, her own voice barely a whisper. "This is about everything. My father's ranch, Thaddeus said the debts were too great. How many of those debts were to him?" She knew, with a sickening certainty, that Croft's greed had likely swallowed her family's legacy. To reveal this ledger was not just to claim a fortune, it was to declare war on the man who owned the town, the man who had laughed at her ruin. As the storm reached its peak, a frantic, desperate banging rattled the door. It was a sound barely audible over the gale, thin and terrified. Will grabbed a heavy piece of firewood as a club, and Jane held the lantern high as he pulled back the blanket. A man stood there, covered in snow, his face etched with panic. "Please," he begged, his teeth chattering. "My wife, the baby is coming." Our wagon broke an axle down the trail. Without a moment's hesitation, Jane pushed past Will. "Bring them in," she commanded. "We'll help the man carry his heavily pregnant wife inside, their small daughter, no older than 5, trailing behind them, weeping with cold and fear." Jane, who had been an outcast only days before, became a beacon of sanctuary. She gave the terrified woman her own blanket, brewed them tea with Alara's herbs, and gave the little girl the warmest spot by the fire. She moved with a quiet competence that amazed Will. This small, determined girl was transforming a cursed outlaw's hideout into a haven. Seeing her in action, her compassion and strength shining in the face of crisis, solidified something in Will's heart. This wasn't just about helping a neighbor. He looked at Jane, who was calmly reassuring the frightened mother, and he knew. "This is your land now, Jane," he said softly, so only she could hear. "Your truth. I'll stand with you." When the storm finally broke 2 days later, the grateful family departed, promising to tell everyone in Redemption Gulch of the angel on Blackwood Ridge who had saved them. The crisis had passed, and Jane's choice was made. She would not hide. She would carry the truth down the mountain. The return to Redemption Gulch was a different kind of journey. Jane and Will rode down the mountain together, Will's steady bay beside a gentle mare he had brought for her from his own remuda. The world was scrubbed clean and silent, draped in a thick blanket of new snow. By the time they reached the town, word had already preceded them. The family Jane had sheltered, the Millers, had kept their promise. The story of the girl in the haunted cabin who had saved a mother and newborn child during the blizzard had spread like wildfire, transforming Jane from the town fool into a local heroine. The stares that followed her now were not of scorn, but of awe and curiosity. People emerged from the storefronts and houses to watch them pass. Their whispers changed in tone. Silas Croft's narrative had been broken, replaced by a new, more compelling one. Jane knew the town's loyalty was a fickle thing, but it was a start. She did not go to the town sheriff. The ledger implicated too many people for her to trust local law. Instead, she and Will went to the hotel and waited. The circuit judge, a man named Elias Miller, was due to arrive that day. Judge Miller was a stern, uncompromising man with a reputation for ironclad fairness. When he arrived, Jane, with Will at her side, approached him in the hotel's dining room. In a clear, steady voice, she requested a public hearing. Intrigued by the strange request from the now famous girl from Blackwood Ridge, he agreed. The only space large enough to hold the gathered crowd was the saloon. That afternoon, the entire town crammed inside, the air thick with anticipation. Jane and Will stood before a large table at the front. With methodical calm, Jane laid out the contents of the satchel, the stack of Union Pacific bonds, the bundle of Sykes's tragic letters, and finally, the damning black ledger. Silas Croft, who had pushed his way to the front, turned purple with rage. "This is an outrage," he bellowed. "This girl is a thief and a liar. She probably stole these things." But then, a quiet man in a city suit, who had been traveling with the judge's party, stepped forward. "I am a claims agent with the Union Pacific Railroad," he announced, his voice cutting through the din. He picked up one of the bonds, examining it closely. "These are genuine. They are part of a shipment reported stolen and presumed lost 5 years ago." A gasp went through the crowd. The judge himself picked up the ledger, his face a grim mask as he scanned the pages. The dates, the names, the specific details, they were too precise to be a forgery. Other men in the room, smaller ranchers and merchants, whose names were also in the book, began to look at their feet, avoiding Croft's furious gaze. The chorus of the town had gone from mocking laughter to stunned silence, and now to a low, angry murmur directed not at Jane, but at the man who had been their master for so long. Croft saw the tide of public opinion turn against him in an instant. His bluster evaporated, leaving him looking smaller. His power stripped away not by a gunshot, but by a girl with a $2 deed and a book full of inconvenient truths. The judge closed the ledger with a snap. "This court will impound this evidence," he declared, his voice ringing with authority. "There will be a full investigation." A month later, the evening sun cast a long golden light over Blackwood Ridge. The change was profound. The cabin stood whole and proud, a thin ribbon of smoke curling from its newly built stone chimney. The sagging porch was gone, replaced by a sturdy, level deck. Where there had been only wilderness, a small, tidy garden was now taking root under Jane's careful hand. The dark soil turned and ready for spring planting. Next to the cabin, A small, well-built corral, which Will had finished the week before, held the gentle mare he had given her. The fear had leached from the land, replaced by a palpable sense of peace, of homecoming. The federal government, guided by the ledger and the railroad agent, had moved swiftly. The bonds were recovered, and a significant portion was awarded to Jane as a finder's fee, a legal right she hadn't even known she possessed. She was no longer poor. But more importantly, she was no longer an outcast. People from Redemption Gulch now made the trip up the ridge, not to gawk or mock, but to trade eggs for repaired tools, to bring news, and to simply sit for a while on her porch and look out at the valley. She had become the quiet center of a community she had inadvertently remade. Will Kincaid rode up as dusk began to settle, dismounting not as a visitor, but as someone who belonged. He came not to help, but to share in the quiet satisfaction of the evening. He leaned on the corral fence next to her, their shoulders almost touching. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sky bleed from orange to violet over the distant peaks. The valley below was settling into shadow, the lights of Redemption Gulch just beginning to twinkle. "You did it, Jane," Will said softly, his voice full of a quiet admiration that meant more to her than all the money from the bonds. "You faced them all down." Jane looked from his face to the solid lines of her cabin, to the dark, tilled earth of her garden, to the vast, quiet sky. She thought of the fear she had felt on her first night, and the peace she felt now. The journey had been about more than finding a treasure. It had been about building a life. "I didn't build a fortress to keep people out," she said, her voice clear and steady in the twilight. "I just mended a home to let the right ones in." Thank you for joining us for this story of quiet resilience. If you were moved by Jane's journey from outcast to anchor, please leave a like and a comment below. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about the strength found in forgotten places. We'll see you next time. She was 21 and put out of her own home. No family left to claim her, no money, and no plan. Just a small, hand-carved bird in her pocket and the $6 from the sale of her mother's locket. And with that $6, she bought the rights to salvage a sunken rowboat from the Clackamas River. But what nobody knew was that sealed inside its waterlogged hull was a secret that would not only prove her father was murdered, but give her the means to reclaim everything he had built. Settle in and let us know where you're watching from tonight. Her real name was Bernice, a name she felt belonged to someone else, someone heavier and slower. Her father, Thomas Hollis, had called her Birdie from the time she was a small girl, a name that fit her quick, watchful movements and her habit of perching on fences and woodpiles to observe the world. The name was sealed forever when, for her 7th birthday, he gave her a small wren, carved from a single piece of mountain mahogany, its tiny form fitting perfectly in the palm of her hand. Thomas was a prospector, a man more at home in the high, lonely canyons of the Cascades than in the small house he kept in Oregon City. His life was a cycle of departures and returns, of dusty hope and occasional modest reward. For his wife, Eleanor, and her son from a previous marriage, Cassius, his absences were a trial, and his profession a source of constant, low-grade shame. They saw him as a dreamer chasing fool's gold while other men built respectable lives as merchants or clerks. But for Birdie, his returns were the center of her year. He would come home smelling of pine sap and campfire smoke, his beard flecked with mica, and his pockets full of strange, beautiful rocks. He taught her the language of the earth, the rusty stain of iron, the greasy feel of soapstone, the sharp, crystalline edges of quartz. He taught her how to work a pan in the cold rush of a creek, swirling away the sand and gravel to find the satisfying weight of color at the bottom. He taught her patience, a virtue he believed was the only true tool a person needed. Her own mother had died of a fever when Birdie was too young to form lasting memories, leaving behind only a faint scent of lavender and a silver locket with a wisp of blonde hair inside. Thomas, lost in his own grief and ill-suited to raising a daughter alone, had married Eleanor a year later. The union was one of practicality, not passion, and the house was cleaved by a quiet, invisible line. On one side were Eleanor and Cassius, who valued propriety and currency. On the other were Bertie and her father, who valued granite, grit, and the promise of what lay hidden. This division left Bertie with long, solitary hours to fill, especially when her father was away in the mountains. She found her refuge down by the river in the workshop of Silas Croft, a widowed boatwright in his late 60s. The shop was a cathedral of wood, smelling perpetually of cedar shavings and hot tar. Silas, a man of few words and deeply competent hands, saw in the quiet, observant girl a spirit kindred to his own. He never spoke down to her. He simply made room for her on his workbench, handing her a piece of scrap wood and a small, sharp knife. He taught her the life of trees, reading their history in the grain of a plank. He taught her the proper way to hold a draw knife, peeling away fragrant curls of wood to shape a curve. He taught her the heft and balance of an adze, the satisfying thud as it bit into an oak rib. He taught her that anything made of wood held a memory, and that with enough care, nothing was ever truly broken beyond repair. It could always be salvaged, repurposed, or returned to the earth with respect. Under his patient, silent tutelage, Bertie's hands became as knowing as her eyes. She learned to caulk a seam, to steam and bend a plank, to plane a surface until it was as smooth as water. She learned the quiet satisfaction of work, the steady rhythm of a task done well, and a self-reliance that grew in her like a strong, straight tree. She carried her father's carved bird in her pocket always, a dense, smooth weight against her leg, a reminder of his love. And she carried Silas's lessons in her hands, a knowledge of how to mend what was broken, a skill she had no idea she would soon need not for a boat, but for her own life. The last time she saw her father, he was more excited than she had ever known him to be. He had spent the previous winter studying maps and assay reports, and he believed he had finally found it. A significant silver lode, high up on the slopes of Tanner Creek. He had taken on a partner, a man named Jacob Finch, who had put up the capital for better equipment. Finch was a newcomer to the area, a man with smooth hands and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. Bertie did not trust him, a feeling she kept to herself, knowing her father was swept up in the venture. "This is it, Bertie," Thomas had said, his eyes bright. "This one will set us right. No more debts, no more apologies. A proper house for you. Everything." He was secretive about the exact location, even with her, a precaution against claim jumpers. He promised to be back in a month, 2 at the most, with ore samples that would silence all the doubters. He kissed her forehead, his beard scratching her skin, and then he was gone, his mule loaded with supplies, heading for the high country. A month passed, measured in the slow lengthening of the summer evenings. Then, too, Bertie's anxiety grew into a low, constant hum beneath the surface of her days. Then, a rider came down from the logging camps in the foothills, bringing news. Thomas Hollis was dead. His body had been found snagged on a logjam in the Clackamas River, miles downstream from where his claim was presumed to be. The official story, passed from the rider to the town sheriff and then to the family, was that it had been a tragic accident. He must have slipped on a slick rock while crossing the creek, hit his head, and fallen into the water, the current carrying him away. Eleanor and Cassius received the news with a practiced, somber gravity. There were no great outpourings of grief. For them, it was the final, unfortunate end to a life of foolish risks. That evening, the administrative cruelty began. Cassius, now 24 and assuming the role of the man of the house with unnerving ease, called Bertie to the kitchen table. He had papers laid out in a neat, damning stack, he explained, in a calm, almost bored tone, that his stepfather had been not just a dreamer, but a reckless one. He had taken out significant loans against their small house to fund his last expedition. Finch had confirmed it, The Tanner Creek claim was a bust, worthless rock. The debts were now due. There was nothing left. The house would have to be sold to settle accounts. Eleanor stood by the stove, her back to the room, polishing a copper pot that was already gleaming. She did not look at Bertie. "There is no room for you where we are going, Bernice," she said, using the formal name that always felt like a punishment. "We will be taking a small apartment. You are of age now. It is time you made your own way in the world." There was no malice in her voice, only a flat final dismissal. It was a simple closing of a ledger. Bertie felt a strange calm settle over her. She did not cry or plead. To do so would have been to give them a satisfaction she was unwilling to provide. She looked at Cassius's smooth, impassive face, at her stepmother's rigid back, and she understood that this had been decided long ago. She simply nodded. She went to her small room and packed a canvas satchel, a spare dress, her father's whetstone, a bar of soap, and the worn copy of Leaves of Grass he had given her. Before she closed the bag, she took her mother's silver locket from its box and slipped it into her pocket. At the door, she paused. She turned back to the kitchen, where Cassius was already stacking his papers. She laid the house key on the table beside his hand. Then she walked out, closing the door quietly behind her, leaving the only home she had ever known without a single backward glance. The $6 she got from the jeweler for the locket felt like both an insult and a fortune. It was all she had. Bertie walked away from the house, her steps steady and measured. She moved through the familiar streets of Oregon City, past the mercantile and the blacksmith's shop, acutely aware of the curious glances and sudden silences that followed her. The news of her father's death and her subsequent eviction had already made its way through the town's swift and merciless network of gossip. She was the prospector's orphan, the foolish girl left with nothing. She saw pity in some faces, a cold satisfaction in others. She met no one's eyes. She had no destination, no plan beyond putting one foot in front of the other. Her feet, acting on an instinct deeper than thought, carried her away from the town center and down the dusty track that led to the Clackamas River. The air grew cooler, scented with damp earth and the sharp fragrance of cottonwood trees. The sound of the water, a low and constant murmur, grew louder, and with it came a sense of solace. This was the landscape of her childhood, the place she had always gone to escape the stifling quiet of her stepmother's house. She followed the river path until she came to a familiar, dilapidated structure half hidden by overgrown salmonberry bushes. It was Silas Croft's old workshop. The boatwright had passed away 2 winters prior, and the place had been left to the slow, patient reclamation of the wilderness. The windows were broken, and the roof sagged in the middle, but the sturdy post and beam frame, built by Silas's own hands, still stood strong. She pushed open the groaning door. Inside, dust motes danced in the shafts of late afternoon light. The air was thick with the ghost smell of cedar and tar. Tools lay on the workbench where Silas had left them, coated in a fine layer of dust and rust, a collection of saws, hand planes, and chisels. It felt less like an abandonment and more like a long pause. She swept a corner of the floor clean with a broken piece of board and set down her satchel. This would be her shelter. For the next several weeks, she lived a marginal existence. She rose with the sun and spent her days in a careful calculus of survival. Using the skills Silas had taught her, she took on small mending jobs from the farmers and fishermen who lived on the outskirts of town, those who cared more for sound work than for social standing. She repaired a broken chair for a handful of potatoes, patched a leaky bucket for a small bag of flour, replaced a rotted fence post for a few cents. She ate sparingly, hoarding the $6 from her mother's locket as if it were the last money on earth. Most of her time, however, was spent by the river. It was the source of her father's death, yet she felt no malice toward it. It was a force of nature, indifferent and powerful, and she found its presence calming. One morning, while scavenging for driftwood, she saw something snagged on a gravel bar in a shallow bend about 100 yards downstream from the old ferry landing. It was a dark, curved shape, the unmistakable line of a boat's hull, mostly submerged in the silty water. Curiosity pulled her closer. She waded out into the cold current, the water swirling around her knees. It was a rowboat about 16 feet long, clinker-built with cedar planking over oak ribs. It was a wreck, half filled with mud and gravel, a large, jagged hole stove in its port side. But the wood, what she could see of it, was good. Silas had taught her to see the potential in such things. The cedar was tight-grained, the oak ribs still solid. There was more usable lumber in that wreck than she could hope to buy in a year. An idea, born of desperation and ingrained practicality, began to form. She could salvage it. The wood alone was worth the effort. The next day, she walked into town and went to the office of the county clerk, a fussy, balding man named Mr. Peters. She asked about the sunken boat. Peters peered at her over his spectacles. That old wreck? Been stuck on that bar since the big flood back in April. It belonged to Jacob Finch. He filed a loss report on it, said it wasn't worth the cost of fetching it out. The name struck her like a physical blow. Finch, her father's partner. The man who had confirmed the mine was worthless. "I want to buy the salvage rights," Bertie said, her voice steady. Peters raised an eyebrow, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. "The rights? Girl, it's trash." "I'll give you $6 for them," she said, laying the entirety of her fortune on the counter. The clerk stared at the coins, then at her, a slow smile spreading across his face. He saw a fool and an easy $6. He drew up a simple bill of sale, his pen scratching across the paper. For the sum of $6, paid in full, all salvage rights to 1-1, sunken rowboat, location specified as the gravel bar south of the Clackamas ferry landing, are hereby transferred to Miss Bernice Hollis. The whispers followed her as she left the clerk's office. The Hollis girl had finally lost her senses. Buying a waterlogged piece of garbage. Let them talk. She had the paper in her pocket and a purpose in her heart. The task of moving the boat was monumental. It lay heavy and inert, a dead weight of wood and water and silt held fast by the river's grip. Bertie had no horse, no winch, no block and tackle. All she had were her own 2 hands, Silas's lessons in leverage and mechanics, and a stubborn refusal to fail. She spent the first day simply observing. She watched the way the current flowed around the hull, where it pushed and where it pulled. She noted the slope of the gravel bar and the position of the large driftwood logs scattered along the bank. Silas had always said that nature would do half the work if you only had the patience to let it. Her plan was not one of brute force, but of slow, methodical persuasion. She began by bailing. Using an old bucket she had repaired, she started the back-breaking work of emptying the hull. For hours, she scooped and lifted, her movements becoming a rhythmic cycle of dip, pull, heave, and splash. The water was frigid, and her muscles quickly began to ache with a deep, burning fatigue. As the water level inside the boat dropped, it grew marginally lighter, but it was still laden with a thick, heavy slurry of mud and gravel. She used her hands to scoop out the muck, handful by painful handful, until the oak ribs were exposed. With the boat partially emptied, she turned her attention to the river itself. Using a long, sturdy pole she salvaged from the riverbank, she began to work on the boat's position. She wedged the pole against a submerged rock and pushed against the stern, not trying to move it much, just to shift its angle by a few inches, allowing the current to get a better purchase on its side. It was a slow, grueling process. The pole would slip, and she would have to reset, her arms trembling with the effort. Slowly, inch by agonizing inch, the boat began to pivot, its bow swinging downstream. The next step was to get it out of the water. She scavenged the riverbank for materials. She found a length of thick, frayed rope, probably lost from a ferry crossing, and a half-dozen straight, smooth logs of driftwood, each about 5 or 6 feet long. These would be her rollers. She spent an entire day digging, using a flat piece of shale as a spade to create a shallow, gently sloping ramp in the gravel, leading from the water's edge up onto the bank. She then maneuvered 2 of the driftwood logs into the water and worked them under the bow of the boat. With the rope tied securely to the bow, she looped the other end around a large, deeply rooted cottonwood tree on the bank. She pulled, not with the strength of her arms, but with the full weight of her body, leaning back until the rope was taut. The boat groaned. The bow scraped against the gravel, then lifted slightly and settled onto the rollers. It had moved less than a foot, but it had moved. For the next 3 days, this was her life. Pull, strain, reset the rollers. The work was a relentless cycle of exhaustion and small victories. The skin on her hands was raw, her back a knot of pain. Sometimes, people from town would stop on the bridge to watch her, a lone figure wrestling with a wreck. She could feel their pity and their scorn, but she blocked it out, focusing only on the task, on the feel of the rope in her hands, and the grating sound of the hull moving over the gravel. Finally, on the evening of the 7th day, the entire boat was clear of the water, resting on the gravel bar like a beached whale. It was a sorry sight. The cedar planks were scarred and bleached. The gunwale was splintered, and the gaping hole in its side looked like a mortal wound. Any other person would have seen only firewood. But Birdie saw the tight grain of the wood, the sturdy oak frame, and the ghost of the elegant vessel it had once been. As she ran her hand along the hull, inspecting the damage more closely, her fingers brushed against a section near the stern that felt wrong. It was too thick, too solid. She tapped it with her knuckles. The sound was a dull, dense thud, completely different from the hollow resonance of the rest of the hull. She tapped again, her brow furrowed. Silas had shown her boats with small, sealed compartments for buoyancy, but this felt different. It was a section about 3 feet long and a foot wide, seamlessly integrated into the hull. There was no hatch, no visible seam. It was a hidden space, deliberately concealed. A cold knot of premonition tightened in her stomach. This was not an accident. This was a secret. The sun was sinking below the western hills, painting the river in hues of orange and purple. The curious onlookers from town had long since departed, leaving Birdie alone in the twilight with the river, the wreck, and the burgeoning mystery of the hidden compartment. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she had to get inside. The hull was far too heavy to move any further. She would have to break it open right here on the gravel bar. She walked the half-mile back to Silas's old workshop, the place that was now both her home and her armory. The air inside was cool and still. She moved with purpose, her exhaustion replaced by a sharp, focused energy. She gathered the tools she would need, items she had cleaned and oiled in the preceding weeks, resurrecting them from their dusty slumber. She chose a heavy wooden mallet with a well-worn handle, a set of 3 iron wedges of varying sizes, a long, flat pry bar, and a small, keen-edged hatchet that had been Silas's favorite for fine work. Returning to the riverbank, she found the boat silhouetted against the fading light. The world had gone quiet. The only sounds the rush of the water over the stones and the distant call of a nightjar. She knelt beside the stern, running her fingers over the section of double hull, again confirming its dimensions. Silas had taught her that a boat is a puzzle, and if you understand how it was put together, you can understand how to take it apart. She would not use brute force, but a careful, surgical deconstruction. She started at the seam where the top plank of the strange section met the one above it. With the hatchet, she carefully chipped away the old, hardened tar and caulking. Then, taking the smallest wedge and the mallet, she found a tiny gap in the seam and tapped the wedge into it. The wood groaned in protest. She moved to the other end of the plank and did the same. Then she took the next sized wedge, driving it in beside the first, widening the gap. The process was slow and deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was small against the vastness of the evening. She worked by feel as much as by sight, sensing the resistance of the wood, the slow yielding of the old iron nails. Finally, a narrow crack appeared along the length of the plank. She inserted the tip of the pry bar into the gap and leaned on it, using her whole body as a lever. There was a sharp crack, the sound of wood fibers tearing, and then a long, splintering groan. The plank popped free. She tossed it aside and peered into the space she had revealed. It was dark, but she could see it was a cavity, just as she'd suspected. Between the inner and outer planks of the hull was a void, and it was not empty. The space had been packed with sawdust to prevent any rattling, and nestled within it, wrapped in a thick, dark bundle, was an object. Her heart began to pound, a heavy, insistent drum against her ribs. For the first time since leaving her father's house, her hands trembled. She reached into the compartment, her fingers brushing against the coarse texture of oilcloth. She pulled the object out. It was a satchel, tightly wrapped and bound with multiple loops of waxed cord, its surface slick with a thin coating of tar to ensure it was waterproof. It was heavier than she expected. She stood up, holding the package in her hands. It felt dangerous, like a dormant thing that was about to wake up. Without a thought for the ruined boat or the tools scattered on the gravel, she turned and carried her discovery back toward the dark, quiet sanctuary of Silas's shack. Inside, she barred the door. The only light was a single tallow candle she lit and placed on the workbench. Its small, flickering flame cast long, dancing shadows across the walls. She placed the satchel on the clean-swept floor and knelt before it. With methodical care, she unwound the waxed cord, her fingers fumbling slightly. Then she began to unwrap the layers of stiff, tarred oilcloth. As the last layer fell away, the contents were revealed, perfectly preserved and dry. In the flickering candlelight of the abandoned workshop, the secrets of the sunken boat lay exposed. There were 3 items inside the oilcloth wrap. The first was a bundle of official-looking papers, folded neatly and tied with a simple piece of twine. Bertie's hands were surprisingly steady as she untied the knot and spread the documents on the floor. They were deeds. She recognized the first one immediately. The deed for the Tanner Creek lode, the silver claim her father had been so certain of. His signature, a familiar, confident script, was there at the bottom. But as she looked at the second and third documents, a cold dread washed over her. They were deeds for 2 other claims further up the valley, both signed over to Mr. Jacob Finch. Tucked beneath these was a 4th paper, a bill of sale transferring the ownership of the Tanner Creek lode from Thomas Hollis to Jacob Finch. It was dated the day after her father's body was officially discovered. She stared at the signature. It was a crude, clumsy imitation of her father's hand, the lines hesitant and uneven where his had been fluid. It was a forgery, a blatant, shameless forgery. The second item was a small, leather-bound ledger, the kind used for keeping business accounts. She opened it. The pages were filled with columns of dates, figures, and notes, all written in Finch's precise, cramped handwriting. The entries detailed ore shipments, supply costs, and payroll for a mining operation. It was the real record of the Tanner Creek claim. Finch hadn't just started prospecting. He had been actively working the mine in secret for weeks, pulling out significant quantities of high-grade silver ore and shipping it out through a different county to avoid notice. He had been lying to everyone. The mine wasn't a bust, it was a treasure trove, and he was stealing it. Her father had been right all along. The final item was a single sheet of paper, folded into a small square and tucked into a pocket at the back of the ledger. It felt different from the official documents. The paper softer, the folds more pronounced. She carefully unfolded it. It was a letter, hastily written, the ink slightly smeared in one corner. As she read the words, the air in the small shack seemed to grow thin and cold. and the sound of the river outside faded to a dull roar. It was in Finch's hand, and it was addressed to her stepbrother. Cassius, it is done. The old man put up more of a fight than I expected up at the creek. Had to hit him harder than I planned. He went into the water and did not come up. The boat is loaded with the papers and his real ledger. I'll sink it in the deep channel above the falls, and we can pull it up next spring when the fuss dies down. Your mother is to play her part. You get the house, I get the mine free and clear. Burn this. J.F. Birdie read the letter once, then twice, then a third time. The words burned themselves into her mind. It is done. Had to hit him harder than I planned. Her father hadn't slipped. He hadn't fallen. He had been murdered, struck down by his own partner, his body thrown into the river like so much trash. And Cassius, her stepbrother, was part of it. The debts, the sale of the house, her eviction. It wasn't just business. It was a conspiracy to get rid of her, to erase every trace of her father so they could steal his legacy. The quiet, administrative cruelty of that day at the kitchen table was suddenly cast in a sickening new light. It was the final act of a murder. She sat on the floor of the dark workshop, the letter in one hand, the candle flame casting a trembling light on her pale face. The grief she felt was no longer the dull, heavy ache of loss, but a sharp, clean agony. It was the grief for a man stolen from the world, for a life cut short by greed and betrayal. In her pocket, her fingers found the smooth, familiar shape of the carved wooden bird. She pulled it out and held it in her other hand. The small piece of wood felt solid, real, a tangible link to the man they had taken from her. The girl who had been cast out was gone. In her place sat a woman with a terrible, clarifying purpose. The sun rose the next morning on a world that was utterly changed. The quiet endurance that had sustained Birdie through her grief and hardship had been burned away in the night, reforged into something harder and colder. Resolve. She knew she could not simply walk into the sheriff's office. She was a destitute young woman with a wild story about a letter found in a sunken boat. Finch was a man of growing importance in the region, and Cassius, though less respected, was still from a family that had held a place in the town. They would dismiss her, question her motives, and perhaps even accuse her of forging the letter herself. Finch and Cassius would be alerted, and the evidence could disappear. No, she would not go to the law. Not yet. The law required proof, but men respected power. The deeds and the ledger were her power. She spent the morning making preparations. She took the damning letter and sealed it inside a small tin box, which she then hid deep within the walls of Silas's shack, behind a loose stone in the fireplace. The deeds and the ledger she wrapped carefully and placed at the bottom of her canvas satchel. From the wreck of the rowboat, she salvaged the best of the cedar planks, the ones that were unscarred, and tied them into a manageable bundle. She packed a small sack with the last of her flour, some salt, and a tin of dried beans. She took her father's whetstone, small axe, and the pry bar from the workshop. Just before dawn, carrying her bundle of wood and her satchel of secrets, she left the river behind and started up the trail that led into the foothills toward Tanner Creek. It was a long and arduous journey on foot, more than 15 miles of steep, winding track. She walked with a steady, relentless pace, her body fueled by a purpose that transcended fatigue. She was not just walking to a place on a map. She was walking to reclaim her father's life. She arrived at the location late the next day. It was not the abandoned prospector's hole Finch had described. A new shaft, timbered and deep, had been cut into the mountainside. An ore cart sat on a short length of newly laid track. Nearby stood a crude, hastily built cabin, a thin plume of smoke rising from its stone chimney. Several men were working near the mine entrance, their faces grim with labor. They stopped and stared as she approached, a lone, dusty figure of a girl carrying a bundle of wood. A large, barrel-chested man with a thick, gray-streaked beard stepped forward. He was clearly the foreman. "This is private property, miss. Best you turn back." Bertie said nothing. She walked directly up to him, dropped her bundle of cedar planks on the ground, and opened her satchel. She took out the deed to the Tanner Creek lode, the one with her father's true signature, and held it out to him. The foreman, whose name she would learn was Gus, took the paper and read it, his brow furrowed in confusion. "This is Thomas Hollis's claim," he said, more a statement than a question. "I am his daughter," Bertie said, her voice clear and even. She then took out Finch's ledger. She didn't hand it to him. She opened it to a page detailing ore shipments and payroll. "And this is Mr. Finch's private account book," she said, her voice loud enough for the other miners to hear. "It shows he's been pulling $20 a pound ore out of this mountain for 2 months. And it shows he's been paying all of you half of what a miner is owed for this grade of work." A silence fell over the camp. The men stopped their work and gathered closer, their eyes moving from the small girl to the foreman's face. Gus stared at the numbers in the ledger, his expression hardening. He and the others had suspected Finch was cheating them, but they had no proof. Now here it was, in black and white, delivered by the ghost of the man they had all been told had failed. "Mr. Finch has been lying to you," Bertie stated simply. "He lied about this mine, and he lied about my father. Gus was a hard man, but not a dishonest one. He had worked claims from California to the Fraser River, and he knew the look of a cooked ledger when he saw one. He passed the book to the man next to him, a wiry miner named Pete. The men murmured amongst themselves, their expressions shifting from suspicion of Bertie to a cold, simmering anger directed at their employer. The numbers in the ledger confirmed what their aching backs and light pockets had been telling them for weeks. They were being robbed. The next morning, when Jacob Finch rode into the camp on his handsome bay gelding, expecting to see a crew of compliant laborers, he was met by a wall of silent, unmoving men. Gus stood at their head, his arms crossed over his massive chest. Bertie stood off to the side, near the cabin, a quiet observer to the storm she had unleashed. "What is the meaning of this?" Finch demanded, his voice sharp with irritation. "Why aren't you men working?" Gus held up the ledger. "We've had a look at your real books, Mr. Finch." Finch's face went pale. His eyes darted from the ledger to the grim faces of the miners, and then they landed on Bertie. A look of pure, venomous hatred twisted his features. "You," he hissed. He began to bluster, to deny, to threaten. He called them liars and thieves, but his protestations were hollow against the damning evidence of his own handwriting. Gus tossed the ledger onto the ground at Finch's feet. "We're done working for shares of nothing," the foreman said, his voice a low growl. "This is Hollis's claim. We quit." One by one, the other miners turned their backs on Finch, gathered their personal tools, and started walking down the mountain trail. Finch, his face a mask of fury and humiliation, was left standing alone. He shot one last murderous glare at Bertie, then wrenched his horse around and galloped away, shouting threats of lawyers and retribution. The silence he left behind was profound. Bertie now possessed the mine, but she was alone. The miners were gone, and she had no crew to work the claim. She moved into the crude cabin, which was little more than a drafty box of green lumber, and began the work herself. She knew the principles of mining from her father, but the physical labor was immense. For 3 days she worked alone, clearing debris, checking timbers, and trying to move the heavy ore cart. Then, on the 4th day, a figure appeared on the trail. It was Gus. He walked up to the cabin, holding his hat in his hands. "Your father was a good man," he said, not looking at her directly. "And Finch is a cheat. This is good rock. It ain't right it should sit here idle. I'll work for a fair share, if you'll have me." Bertie simply nodded, and just like that, she had her first partner. A few days later, another man arrived. He was older, with kind eyes and hands gnarled by a lifetime of labor. His name was Abel, and he had known her father years ago. He looked at the shoddy cabin, at the wind whistling through the cracks. "A person needs a sound roof over their head," he said gruffly. Abel was a carpenter by trade. He took the cedar planks Birdie had salvaged from the rowboat, the wood that had started everything, and with meticulous skill, he began to repair the cabin. He used the smooth, fragrant boards to patch the walls and line the inside, turning the shack into a snug and worthy shelter. Soon after, another visitor made the trek up the mountain. It was not a miner, but an elderly woman named Mrs. Gable, a widow whose husband had also been a prospector. She carried a basket containing a steaming pot of venison stew and a fresh loaf of bread. "A body can't live on grit and determination alone," she announced, setting the basket on the small table. From then on, she made the trip twice a week, a silent, steady offering of nourishment and solidarity. The community grew, one quiet act at a time. Henderson, the blacksmith from town, heard the story and rode up to sharpen her father's old pickaxes and drills for free. Pete, the wiry miner, returned with 2 others, ready to work for a woman they respected rather than a man who had cheated them. They did not work for wages but for shares in the mine's future, becoming not employees but partners. Together they were building something new, an enterprise founded not on a lie, but on the truth Birdie had pulled from the river, with the mine producing a steady stream of high-grade silver and a loyal crew of partners by her side. Birdie Hollis was no longer a destitute orphan. She was the proprietor of the Tanner Creek Lode, a position of substance and authority earned through grit and integrity. The small community they had formed on the mountainside was one of mutual respect, its bonds forged in shared labor and the common goal of seeing justice done. After 2 months of hard work, they had amassed enough ore and enough capital. The time had come to face Finch and Cassius. Birdie, Gus, and Abel rode down from the mountain. They were no longer a solitary girl and 2 disgruntled miners. They were a delegation, representing a legitimate and profitable enterprise. They did not stop at the edge of town, but rode directly to the sheriff's office on the main street. Sheriff Miller was a weary man who preferred to deal with drunkards and petty thieves, not complicated matters of property and murder. When Birdie had been alone, he might have dismissed her out of hand. But now she entered his office flanked by Gus, whose formidable presence filled the doorway, and Abel, a man known throughout the county for his quiet honesty. Birdie laid her evidence on the sheriff's desk with the same deliberate calm she had used to dismantle the rowboat. First, the forged bill of sale for the mine. Second, Finch's ledger, open to the pages that proved his fraud against the miners. Third, the original deed in her father's name. And finally, she produced the small, folded letter, its words stark and brutal in the quiet office. She told the story from the beginning. The murder, the sinking of the boat, the conspiracy with her stepbrother, the theft of her home. Gus and Abel stood by, their silent presence a powerful testament to the truth of her words. Sheriff Miller read the letter, his expression growing grimmer with each line. He looked at the ledger, at the deeds, and then at the determined face of the young woman before him. He was a town sheriff, not a fool. He had the physical evidence, the motive of immense profit, and the corroborating testimony of respected men. He had no choice but to act. Warrants were issued for the arrests of Jacob Finch and Cassius Thorne. Finch was apprehended at the hotel where he had been living, blustering about his rights and his lawyers, until the sheriff showed him his own letter. He fell silent. Cassius was arrested at the small apartment he shared with his mother. He collapsed into tears, confessing his part in the conspiracy before they even reached the jail. The town that had first pitied, then mocked Birdie, was now electrified by the scandal. The story of the prospector's murdered father, the greedy partner, the treacherous stepbrother, and the daughter who brought them all to justice became the legend of the county. Her stepmother, Eleanor, disgraced and implicated by her son's confession, packed her bags and left town on the next stagecoach, vanishing without a word. Bertie Hollis became a name spoken with a new kind of reverence. She ran the Tanner Creek mine with a steady hand, ensuring every partner received their fair and honest share. The mine thrived, and so did the small community around it. She used some of the profits to buy her father's house back, not to live in, but to turn into a boarding house for miners' widows, with Mrs. Gable as its manager. Her own home was the cabin on the mountain, the one Abel had so carefully rebuilt, the walls now paneled with the smooth, fragrant cedar from the boat that had delivered her father's last testament. A year passed. Winter came again to the high country, blanketing the mountainside in a deep, quieting layer of snow. Inside the cabin on Tanner Creek, a fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting a warm, golden light across the room. The air was filled with the scent of pine smoke from the fire, the rich aroma of Mrs. Gable's baking from the small oven, and the faint, clean smell of the cedar-paneled walls. The cabin was no longer a crude shelter but a home, solid and warm against the winter wind. Bertie sat at a sturdy oak desk that had once been her father's. She had paid to have it hauled up the mountain, a piece of her past now firmly planted in her future. She was going over the mine's ledgers, not with the anxiety of debt, but with the quiet satisfaction of prosperity. The Tanner Creek Lode was one of the most successful small mines in the region. Gus, Abel, Pete, and the others were not just her partners. They were her family, a community built on a foundation of truth. On the corner of the desk, where the light from the fire caught them, sat two small objects. One was the little wren her father had carved for her from mountain mahogany, its wood dark and smooth from years of being carried in her pocket. Next to it rested a small, rectangular block of wood, sanded to a silken finish. It was a piece of the cedar planking from the rowboat, the very plank she had pried loose on that fateful evening by the river. She put down her pen and picked up the carved bird, its familiar weight a comfort in her palm. She thought of her father, not of the violent manner of his death, but of his unshakable belief, his dreamer's heart that had seen a treasure in this rock. She thought of Silas Croft, the quiet boatwright who had taught her that nothing is ever truly lost if you have the patience to see its worth. And she thought of the people in the town below, the ones who had seen only a foolish girl and a piece of floating trash. She looked from the bird to the piece of the boat, one a symbol of a father's love, the other a symbol of his vindication. They were just two small pieces of wood, but they held the whole story. Bertie Hollis was 21 when she was put out of her home. She had $6 to her name, and she spent it all on a sunken boat. It was the best $6 she ever spent. From the cold water of the river, she had salvaged more than just timber and a secret. She had salvaged her father's name, she had reclaimed her future, and she had built, with her own two hands, a home.